Yo guys, Superior David here. Voyage to the Sunken City is about to release, or maybe it has already released depending on when you're watching this video, which means it's time for me to give you decks that you can play day one of the expansion. So I have for you today 10 superior decks that you can play day one of Voyage to the Sunken City, and as always, there's one deck for each class with a mixture of competitive, meme, and more budget conscious decks. So hopefully there's a little something for everyone out here. And by the way, some of these decks are variations of things that I played in the theory crafting event, so I'll put a playlist to those highlights up in the corner if you want to see some of these archetypes in action. But anyways, without further ado, sit back, relax, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get into these decks. As is tradition on the channel, we'll be starting things off with my favorite class, Druid, and I have for you today my take on Ramp Druid, which incorporates some of the new Naga cards. The idea behind this deck is that you mana ramp so you can start dropping expensive spells early, with the new important ones being the Flipper Friends and Miracle Growth. While one is clearly more adorable than the other, they're both great defensive tools that can also become decent threats themselves. Then we run some of the big spell Naga payoff minions to capitalize on these big spells even more, which I think people are mixed on whether this package will be enough to close out games. So for a little bit more lethality, I threw in the new Queen Ajara and then Kazakus, because we just don't run any 4-drops. So I feel like Kazakus is actually pretty decent in this deck now because we've got Guff and Moonlit Guidance, and I feel like we could probably do something broken with those cards in conjunction with these. But will all of this be better than Kazakus-san? I think that's the question we'll be looking to answer day one. So let's keep our fingers crossed for that. Now moving right along to Hunter, I decided to brew a Quest Hunter because I played against quite a few in the Theorycraft event, and the archetype felt really insane due to the new card Barbed Nets. This card feels absolutely busted because it could potentially advance your quest twice if you played a Naga with it in your hand. So we run quite a few Nagas to ensure we can make that happen, with the important ones being the Rajnajan and the Twin Terror Coil, because they allow you to get more value from your burn spells. And you can actually find these specific Nagas, fairly consistently with the new Conscious Call, which makes all the Nagas just so much better since you can always guarantee a spell to proc their effect since you also tutor up a spell with them. But anyways, the rest of this deck is relatively standard, so if you've been jamming Quest Hunter before the expansion, then this deck won't be too much of an investment for you if you don't want to spend too much dust. But overall, I think that Quest Hunter is really well positioned going into the Voyage into the Sunken City, so definitely keep an eye on this archetype. Okay, now listen up people, because we're moving on to Mage, and this is easily the best archetype that I played the whole Theorycraft stream, and that is Mech Mage. Where the original Mech Mage was a very linear deck, I find this iteration is actually incredibly flexible in its game plan. You can win games by curving out aggressively and topping off with Gaia the Tectonic, who's actually busted by the way, or you can play with a more value-oriented game by chaining together all these mechs that generate other mechs and go pseudo infinite with your mech value. And then you can even win in a combo fashion by discounting your hand with Seafloor Gateway and popping off with Mecha Shark and a bunch of cheap mechs. And with such a small mech pool due to rotation, you can reliably generate extra copies of Mecha Shark and Gaia the Tectonic to the point where you can probably just cut the Gaia and still do decently well with this deck if you want to make this a bit more budget. But don't mistake that for me saying that Gaia is bad, because I honestly think it's the most busted minion in this deck, and I feel like people just totally underrated this Colossal going into the expansion. And if you want to see this deck in action, you should definitely check out the Theorycraft highlights, because I feel like this deck is just so insane, and I'll be absolutely just shocked if it's not good day one. But anyways, moving right along to Priest, we have an archetype that I played in theory crafting and was really impressed with, and that is Miracle Priest. Now, believe it or not, I was actually surprisingly underwhelmed by the Northshire Cleric in this deck due to the lack of AoE healing in Standard at the moment. So I actually cut the Northshire Cleric, which I know feels sacrilegious to your priest mains out there, but trust me on this. And so when revisiting the deck, I decided to lean more into the Naga package, because the Nagas not only offer you consistent card draw and better synergy, but also some decent win conditions. But of course, because this is Miracle Priest, we still got the good old elementals, Lyra the Sun Shard and Radiant Elementals, so we could scam games with mana cheating and random cards. So this stuff still feels really powerful in my opinion. And for a bit of redundancy, I even decided to include the Amalgam of the Deep to potentially get extra copies of these powerful minions just from either tribe, which sort of like Mech Mage, I think you can do this fairly consistently due to the small minion pool. But overall, the best card in the deck is easily the Wild Pyromancer, with its ability to demolish boards with all of the cheap spells at this deck's disposal. And you could absolutely run away with games if you can manage to stick one of these on the board. So I know people were a bit mixed on Priest this past year, but with the return of Wild Pyro to Standard, I actually have really high hopes for the class going into Year of the Hydra, and hopefully Miracle Priest will be the deck to make waves for the class going forward in Voyage to the Sunken City. Okay, so moving on to Shaman, I have for you a Spell School Battlecry Shaman, and I really hope we come up with a shorter name for this archetype come release. But anyways, the idea here is that we play spells from different spell schools with the support of the new Ajaran Scroll and Radiance of Ajara, and then we drop the Coral Keeper to generate this big board out of nowhere and try to snowball that to a victory. Then to back all this up, we've got a Battlecry sub theme going on here, and can recur battle cries with Macaw, or double them up with both Bolner and Bran, which I thought could be a lot of fun. For that reason, I also decided to include the Queen Ajara, because I think you could do some pretty busted things if you can like combine two of her treasures together. And you know, to be honest, I wasn't even considering Ajara in this deck until someone like absolutely destroyed me with it in theory crafting. So I'm a bit more bullish on the card now, and that's why it's finding its way into a lot of my lists, if you couldn't tell. And with Lightning Bloom and the spell damage package rotating, I think the Ajara will help give Shaman some, you know, more tools to close out games. So I guess, you know, keep an eye on Shaman. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on with the class, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over the Voyage to the Sunken City. Okay, so next up we've got Paladin, and I decided to refine the mech Paladin list that I played in the theory crafting event because it was just so much fun to play. And after tinkering with the deck a bit, it feels like at its core, this is a mid-range deck. You want to curve out every game, and sometimes you could just win by going, you know, Security Automaton into Sea Scout Operator and like playing more aggressively that way. But if you need to, you can adopt like a slower game plan now due to the new Radar Detector, which allows you to gas back up your hand to just keep that pressure going. And I found that I was typically drawing like 3 mechs off of Radar Detector, but even if you only draw like 2 mechs, you're still pretty okay with that because Paladin is traditionally not the best at drawing cards. Or I don't know, maybe that's changing because the Leviathan offers some really good card draw because you can dredge first to select the card you want to draw and then like immediately draw it, all the while you're generating tempo because both parts of the of this Colossal have rush. So I found this card to be pretty impactful, really fun card to play with too. And I say overall, Mech Paladin has a lot of the same things going for it as Mech Mage, but you know, I think I'm still team Mech Mage if I had to pick between either of these mech decks. Now moving on to Rogue, I have for you my take on Pirate Rogue, which feels more like an aggro deck to me, so I threw in, you know, just a bunch of the cheap pirates, with the best ones being the Fillet Fighter for its ping effect and aggressive stats, the Putter Fist, which I was really impressed with because of its like 1 damage AoE, and then the Cutlass Courier for card draw. And I think card draw is very important because Rogue is losing a lot of its card draw, so you're definitely relying on the Cutlass Courier as well as the new Dredge cards that sort of improve the quality of your draws. And I found the Dredge cards to be really useful for this, even though I decided to cut like all the Dredge payoff cards because, you know, honestly, I just found them to be very slow and not the most impactful. Speaking of slower cards, even though we're an aggressive deck, we do have a couple of more expensive, slower pirates, like the Bootstrap Sunkeneer for those tempo plays, and then the Pirate Admiral Hook Tusk, just for some all-around scamming. But if you want to make this deck more budget-friendly, then, you know, feel free to cut these more expensive pirates. I think you can still do pretty well with this deck otherwise, because it is a more aggressive deck, and you also run the Amalgam of the Deep, so you're going to be able to pretty reliably like discover these cards if you really want to anyways. Now moving on to Warlock, I have for you a Murloc Warlock, which is an archetype that seems to be getting pushed super hard in Voyage to the Sunken City. Not only are there good neutral Murlocs returning to standard like the Murloc Warleader, Cold Light Seer, and Lushwater Scout, just really good tempo option there. But Warlock is receiving like all this good Murloc hand buffing support with Void Gill, Ajar and Scavenger, and Bloodscent Vilefin, sort of forming like the backbone of this perfect hand buffing curve for this archetype. Chum Bucket seems pretty good as well, but I was actually more impressed with the minions here because this is definitely a deck that wants to just curve out and play minions every turn. And our curve is a bit higher than your typical Zoo deck, so I actually found myself surprisingly not really using like my life tap hero power too much. So I included the Gorlock Ravager in this deck just for some, you know, curving out hand reload. And I will say that besides cutting the Murloc Tiny Fin, which absolutely like broke my heart, another noticeable exclusion is the new Sir Finley, which felt sort of bad in this archetype because so much of this deck revolves around buffing Murlocs in your hand, and it feels pretty bad to invest those resources into buffing those Murlocs just to get rid of them with like Sir Finley's effect. It's just totally counterintuitive, and my hot take is that overall the new Sir Finley is going to be one of the most overrated cards of the new set, so, you know, bring on the YouTube comment judgment, people. Okay, so next up we've got Demon Hunter, and I decided to go with a Fel Demon Hunter that has a whisper of big demon synergy. I was really impressed with Lady Stheno in theory crafting. She was just like a really good tool at denying your opponent's board development and can also get in some decent chip damage herself to help close out games alongside Jace. Just like a nice little 1-2 punch there. But if that's not enough, we've also got a big demon package just for some extra inevitability. The new Xylag is a really fun card that can help you get in more like chip damage as well as just run away with games himself if your opponent just can't answer him. And I know I was just talking mad smack about Sir Finley, but he actually seems reasonable in this list just due to the Karya Fel Soul. So like if you happen to draw all of your big demons, you could just throw them back into your deck with Sir Finley, and Karya is no longer a dead card. And I think instances like these is going to be how you want to use Sir Finley's effect, rather than just like throwing him into like any deck to arbitrarily just refresh your hand, which doesn't feel too good for me. But overall, Demon Hunter like lost a lot of its core cards, so it's going to be really interesting to see if the new cards it's receiving will be enough to sort of pick up the slack there. But I can say for sure that the class will be a lot of fun to play because that new Xylag is just super spicy. Now finally, we've got Warrior, and I have for you a Quest Pirate Warrior, which feels like the archetype receiving the most support support in Voyage to the Sunken City, just for the warrior class, I decided to include the new Ajaran Trident, which feels like the new weapon of choice for this archetype. If you happen to draw it early, you can proc the death route to shuffle the Sunken version into your deck and then still have something to tutor up with your quest completion. Or you can make use of the new Obsidian Smith to dredge it off the bottom of your deck, also get like a little buff going and, just tutor up that way while also advancing your quest. And I've talked a bit in this video about the Amalgam of the Deep, as well as the Pufferfist to some extent, and I think they're going to put in work in this deck for the same reasons as I've mentioned earlier in this video. But one card I haven't talked about is Nelly, which feels like one of the best colossals because you have an amazing chance at generating a 1-mana copy of Mr. Smite. And even if you don't, you can get 1-mana copies of other big pirates and just play them along the Mr. Smite you run in your deck just normally, and you can just close out games that way. So like a lot more lethality for Quest Pirate Warrior. I think overall, while Warrior is getting the oddest mixture of cards this expansion, it's getting a couple of serious all-stars to slot into existing archetypes. So I think Warrior will actually be in pretty decent shape in Voyage to the Sunken City. And there you have it, 10 superior decks that you can play day one of Voyage to the Sunken City. And again, if you want to see any of these decks in action, I've got plenty of theory crafting highlights that you can check out. But before you do that, make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, let me know down in the comments what you'll be playing day one of the expansion. Always love to hear that. But in the meantime, stay superior and I'll catch you in the next one. Later. Dirt.